We're joined once more on iCatholic by Julieann Moran, the General Secretary of the Synodal Pathway of the Catholic Church in Ireland. People will have been hearing about Synod and Synodality for the last couple of years, and I suppose we want to kind of update with where we are, but let's go right back. So for people who are maybe just tuning in, when we talk about Pope Francis has called a Synod on Synodality, well, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I suppose way back in October 2021, Pope Francis announced that he was holding a synod on the theme of synodality. And I think for many of us, we might have known what a synod was somewhat about, but nobody had an idea of how you would have a synod on being in synod. So that was way back in October 2021, and very quickly we found ourselves all around the world going into the first stage of a synod, which was going to be completely different. I think in the past people were used to maybe bishops just going to Rome, taking part in the synod and coming back with a document with an update on church teaching. But this time Pope Francis wanted every baptised person involved in the synod.
Tell us a bit about your experience of the initial conversation.
Yeah, I think that's been hugely successful, because the most memorable piece for me, and it feels like so long ago, but between that October and May, the number of people who came out and said, this is the first time in my life that I have been asked my opinion, or I have been asked to share something of the lived reality of my life with people in my parish, people in my diocese, with my bishop, and that it was going to have an effect on what was going to happen on the floor of an assembly somewhere in Rome in the future. So that for me was a profound shift. And we saw that up and down the length and breadth of Ireland. And that became a document that we published then called the National Synthesis of the Irish Catholic Church, which became the Irish contribution way back then to the first stage of the Universal Synod.
Before we went to Rome, there was the continental phase in Prague, which was a kind of a building block on the way, and you got to summarise for the people there what was the Irish report.
That's it, and I think just the things that remain with me from that are probably threefold. First of all, that genuine sense of belonging that people desire, and that sense of that. There was a lovely line in the Irish synthesis that later made it into the continental document, that those who feel at home in the church really feel the absence of those who don't. So that huge sense of belonging that people desire is one thing that remained with me from that text. The other is that lens of woundedness that we looked through, abuse being part of the story of who we are as the Catholic Church in Ireland and universally, obviously was a theme here. But to be able to look through that woundedness to other people who felt wounded. So we brought that sense and that voice to the floor of the assembly in Prague. And the third part then would have been that if we don't get that right, if we don't somehow transform that woundedness in all of its realities, we won't be able to achieve communion, participation and mission. So that was kind of the third sense of being able to bring in all of those other people into relationship with us again, if we can get that sense of that transformative healing right.
All those building blocks, literally we're building the conversation, as you say, and the conversation isn't just one way, it reverses itself and says, how are we doing? That's happened a number of times. Yeah. But finally then, last October, we got to what's known the universal stage, and there was that site, the church now is a round table and all of that. So maybe talk about that.
Yeah, so very different again with this first round. I suppose three distinct things. One was the round tables. Everybody honed in on the imagery of that alone, and the fact that the Holy Father himself was a participant at a round table, had a very different dynamic to that pyramidical sense that we normally have of the way that the church functions. The other that was key was that that first working document for that first session was extremely different. We were used to getting a theological reflection on the theme that the bishops would be going to Rome to discuss. This time it was 15 worksheets. So there was a real sense that if you're going to Rome as an assembly member, you're pulling up your sleeves and you're going to have work to do. So 15 worksheets, asking more than 100 questions, rather than sort of repeating doctrine or repeating, canonical structures. So that was very, very different. The third then obviously was hugely significant that Pope Francis introduced voting members to the structure of the Synod of Bishops that had never happened before. So we had 70 plus non-bishop members taking part as voting members, 54 of whom were women across that platform.
Cardinal Grech sat in that chair a couple of months ago. I was saying to him that the Synod is almost a victim of its own success, because when people were asked, they had a lot to say about every issue, and in some ways it's almost swamped the process, because synodality is about the method, not so much about the issue. So what has emerged over the last year? I know Cardinal Grech was kind of saying we need to focus on synodality.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was a victim of its own success, because we got so many different themes and realities that came up because of the question that the Synod was asking. The Synod was asking us, how are we actually doing at being a synodal church? And the answer came in tenfold, that there was all of these aspects that needed to be looked at if we were to become a synodal church. And I think what's happened is that some of the themes are so important in terms of the lived reality for people that they deserve that level of study and reflection, and they'll all report back in June 2025 to the Holy Father, because they're not going away and they do deserve the attention that they need.
People shouldn't think that everything is being passed over to working groups. The big themes of governance, authority, decision-making, inclusion, particularly the place of women in the church, all of that is there.
So I see very clearly now 5 areas in the Instrumentum Laboris. There's the general introduction, which is a bit like what we're doing now, looks at the journey so far, how we've gotten to where we've gotten to. What I really liked in that introduction was the affirmation now that the conversation in the Spirit methodology is being afforded its place all around the world, where people have reportedly written back and said, we have used this methodology for discernment in our local church, and we really loved working this way, and it has transformed the way we reach some decisions. So I suppose we've done that a lot here in Ireland as well. We've been practicing it in our leadership programme that we've been rolling out. We've been encouraging parishes to use it. We've been encouraging dioceses. The Bishops' Conference itself has been using that methodology. So that's really reaffirming that conversation in the Spirit methodology is getting the accolade it deserves, because it truly has worked.
When do you think people will actually hear something officially?
Yeah,
like the final
officially.
word,
Yeah, it's interesting, because some of the language I'm hearing from the Secretariat of the Synod in Rome is that whilst the Assembly will conclude in October 2024 this year, the process of becoming a synodal church won't. So there's a sense there that we are still, we almost still have the little training wheels on our bicycles, and that it'll be a while before we get to take those off. And I see that in the document itself, in the way that it's laid out. I see like clear pathways there. I think it's laying out the foundations that need to be in place. It's laying out how the relationships between the local churches, the relationships between men and women in the church, the relationships between the ordained, between the bishop, the priest and deacons needs to, be adapted. It's talking about the relationships between Christian brothers and sisters. So it's saying there's a lot there already that's proposing changes in the relationships. There's more proposed changes and adaptations, some of those being canonical, in order for the relationships, which is at the heart of who we are as church, rather than the structures. But we need the structures. So the second one is adaptations to the way that we are forming people in faith, the way that we're forming people in what it means to be a synodal church, the way that we provide every baptized person with the skills to be a discerning Catholic, so that they can take part in the decision making. So that's why the second strand there is pathways, so that those relationships find new pathways to be able to do these things in different ways. And then that concrete sense of that we're all very different in the different places where the church manifests itself. We've got our own contexts, our own historical contexts and our own cultures. So the relationships and the plans for formation and discernment need to find its own concrete way to emerge in those succinct places. So I see a clear roadmap in the instrumentum laboris. And I suppose over the period of this assembly, the task that those that go to Rome have is discerning everything that's in that document now, to be able to rubber stamp something that says this is how our structure is going to change. These are the canon laws that might be adapted so that our pastoral councils, our diocesan councils, our episcopal conferences are more transparent, more accountable, and evaluations get carried out so that we grow rather than have a status quo. If all of that gets passed, I think that that's what's at the heart and the beauty of what it means to be a synodal church. Then what's happening in the working groups will be not easier to discern, but we will have the discernment methods, structures and relationships in place to look at those themes and issues and the lived realities in a very different way, because we'll have done the work through this synod on synodality.